What is good, everybody? My name is Taetro here with ujam, and today we're talking all about the Beatmaker plugin. A Beatmaker plugin gives you access to genre-authentic drum kit, patterns and phrases, all of which you can control with a MIDI controller, and all of which you can start throwing into the arrangement of your tracks to have a smooth beat-making process. I'm going to show you everything you need to know to start making beats with the Beatmaker plugin, but first I want to play you some quick demos to demonstrate the variety across the Beatmaker titles. There are many Beatmaker titles across a number of different genres, but I'm going to show you 5 demos created with my favorites. First, we have Dope, which is great for boom bap, hip hop, and rap beats. Next, Analog Warmth and Classic Grooves, with the sound of drum machines all the way back from the 70s in circuits. Next, we have Glory, which is meant for trap beats, modern hip hop. It's even got a tunable 808 right here in the plugin interface. Next, my personal favorite, Vice, where you can get that classic synthwave or 80s pop sound. And finally, the lazy, behind-the-beat lo-fi vibes of Cozy. You probably noticed that all the titles look quite distinct with their artwork, but if you look a little closer, you can see that the plugin's general anatomy is the same across the different titles. Let's start digging in with the classic hip-hop boom-bap vibes of Dope. I'll solo this beat here for a moment. Since I already have a pattern loaded here in my DAW, which we're going to get to how to do in a moment, you can see that the keyboard here is lighting up with all the individual drum pieces. That is the simplest way to play the Beatmaker plugin with a MIDI controller. You can literally click on the keys here, or you can draw them in as MIDI notes. You can see that these individual drum hits, you can see a C1 right here and a C2 right here, which means if you have a MIDI controller or if you're looking to draw in the notes, you can access each individual drum, which is labeled on each key in that range of the keyboard. First, let's talk about how to dial in our sound with Beatmaker. I've got Dope loaded up here, and I'm going to play a pattern from the plugin. Let's focus on the top half of the plugin for the moment. You'll notice that we have a few different sliders we can play with. This kick and snare slider will help us isolate either the kick, you can see our snare has gone away, or we can isolate the snare. So as you raise or lower this slider, we go towards kick, we'll get less and less snare. And the same thing vertically for taking out the kick. We only get snare. Slowly faded out. That can be fun for performance as that slider is actually mapped to our pitch bend if you're using a MIDI controller. Now in the center of these two sliders, you can see that we can scan through different kits. I'm going to go ahead and turn down the effects so we get just the pure sound of the kits. We'll get to the effects in a moment. So for each title, you'll be able to scan through and get a different sound depending on the track you're working on. And as you can hear, there's a lot of variety in the kits. Next, we have a slider that might change depending on the title that you're in. Since this is a classic hip hop title, we have Vinyl Drive, which will add a lot of vinyl crackle to our beat. And a bit of drive, of course. Next, on the right, we have controls pertaining to the mix. And there are different mix presets in the different titles of Beatmaker. So here we're in the mix preset Gem. If I scan through, going to get totally different sounds. Here's a lo-fi sound with a really bit crushed sound, right? And then we also have beat intensity. You can hear the whole beat is becoming a bit lighter now. I'm going to bring down our vinyl drive so we can hear that. It's a bit lighter, more quiet, and as I bring up beat intensity, we start hammering home like a lot harder. We of course also have an amount slider, which adjusts the amount of the mix preset being applied to our kit. You can see that mostly our lo-fi sound has gone away. We have a little bit of that vinyl drive. No bit crushing happening, no lo-fi happening, or it's happening a minimal amount. If I increase that, this lo-fi mix effect becomes more prevalent. So we have controls over our drum kit and controls over our mix in Beatmaker. To show you that that's relatively the same across titles, let's just jump over to Vice. You can see that we have the same layout with a couple differences. We still have our kick and snare slider. We have an effect called Time Machine here in Vice. Again, specific to the title itself. We're going into the synthwave future up to 2080. You can hear it's giving that sort of like lasery sound as we get further into the future. Let's bring it back down to 1980. Just more of the vintage 80s drum sound. We can scan through different kits, same as before. And over here on the mix side, we of course have mix profiles that are tailored specifically for the Vice title, Cyber, Gigawatt. We can make that more intense and bring up the amount of that mix effect, or bring it down. Same exact layout across the different titles. You will have a different effect based on the title, and you will of course have different kits and mix presets. The Beatmaker plugin, of course, has presets, which you can access here at the top. Depending on the preset you choose, you will get different combinations of mix presets, effect intensity, different patterns, which we'll get into in a moment. But the different presets each have their own sound. And if you start dialing in to get your own sound, maybe you change the kit, maybe you change some parameters up here, you can always save the preset, give it a name, and that preset will become a part of your user library. We actually have even more control of the sound. Let's switch to another title just to keep things fresh. I think now we'll switch over to Cozy, laid back, lo-fi, lazy vibes. So now I want to direct your attention to the bottom of the plugin below all of the keys. On the left side here, we have control over the sound of our individual drums. So as I click across the keyboard, you're going to see this section change depending on which drum we have selected. So let's just select this snare for now. You can see that we have 4 different controls for the snare. We of course have a volume. You can change the individual mix of a sound. We have the decay, which will be sort of the tail end of the sound. How long does the sound last for? You can hear this snare getting shorter and shorter. The pitch, higher or lower. And the filter. We have both a high pass and a low pass filter here. You'll also notice that we have the ability to switch the individual sample of the snare. So we can get a totally different sound, whereas before when we switched to the kit, it changed the samples for all of the sounds in the kit. We can change just individual drum sounds here in this menu. And let's click back to our bass drum, our kick. You can see that the controls are the same and that we can do the same thing for our kick drum. We can change samples, volume, decay, pitch, and filter. And that is the same if we move up the entire drum kit. Same controls, same ability to switch the individual samples. Another thing we can also do is solo and mute individual drums. We have the solo and mute button here. So let's go ahead and just solo our kick drum and mute the kick drum. Next, you might notice this little switch here, individual and master. That is because all of our drum sounds are being sent to our master, which contains a few more effects that will change the sound. Now, we could select individual for a specific drum sound like the kick drum if we want it to bypass the master and not go in through any of the effects here on the master. That will of course depend on you knowing what's happening on the master, so let's talk about that now. So on the master, you can see we have 4 different controls. We have sweep, which is a filter sweep, high pass, and low pass filter. We have saturate, add more saturation to the sound, a little more crunch. Maximize, which is really going to push our sound. You're going to hear it get a bit louder here and a bit more compressed as well. And ambience, which is going to add a space, a reverb to our sound. And we have different types of ambience here as well, so we can cycle through these for a different sound. So we've gone over the top of the plugin, the bottom of the plugin, but you've probably noticed notes lighting up here and these 2 keyboards in the center of the plugin. Let's start talking about those now. And of course, to just keep you familiar and on your toes, let's switch to a different title. This is Glory, made for modern hip hop and trap. And I want to point out one thing special about Glory before we talk about putting in notes and patterns. The slider that we saw was usually an effect for the other titles. In Glory, it's actually an 808 tuner. So you can even automate this slider and make the 808 move across the beat. But that's just a special cool thing about Glory. Now into this section down here, and let's start by focusing on the instrument section. So on this side, we have access to the individual drum hits, and we can access those from a MIDI controller, and they also are associated with a note range. Obviously, you can see C1 here on the bass drum, all the way up to C2 on percussion 1, up to D sharp 2 on cymbal 2. So of course we can play in notes on our keyboard, or you can draw in notes on the piano roll. That's pretty simple and straightforward. But next, let's jump into this section here, this other keyboard, which is where the magic happens. You can see that these keys are labeled C3 through C4. So let's get our MIDI controller in range. And when I hold down this key, you notice that we're actually getting a full pattern, not just an individual drum. And those patterns are different across the keyboard. Take a look at the labels here. You can see that we have verses, choruses, specials, and stop. We'll get into stop in a moment. These are the different sections of a song, so the energy level of the beats will be according to what part of the song they're meant to belong in. So verses, they've got a little bit of energy. The choruses will have a bit more going on in them and a bit more energy to them. And specials will be just unique patterns that you would use in maybe a bridge of a song or sort of a special section of a song. That isn't your typical verse or chorus. Notice that we have labels above. We have intros, fills, endings, and breakdowns. Breakdowns tend to be the section of the song where things get a little quiet before more energy comes in. Things start to build up. Things start to mellow out. Intros, fills, and endings are actually pretty unique. I want to jump over to Vice again because they have pretty interesting fills. So if I play a fill from Vice, you can hear it's got that drum roll sort of feel, and these fills are meant to transition from one section to another or liven up a long sequence. Intros are of course the introduction to your song. So you might want to start a song that way. And endings are, of course, specific to how a song is going to end, like just a kick and a crash and a snare, or a short pattern that sort of just fades out. When we combine all these, we can come up with really cool and fun patterns. So other than holding down this key, how do we get these patterns into our DAW? Well, of course, since these are individual notes that we can write in as MIDI, that would be the simplest way. So C4 here on the keyboard, if I create a new MIDI clip in Ableton Live and I find C4 and let's just make that last for a full bar and I press play on the clip, we're getting the full pattern because it's being triggered by that C4 note. If we keep going up the keyboard, we get different patterns. So notes are associated with these individual patterns. If I wanted to use a fill, which is on F#3, I could go ahead into the MIDI and we could put a fill right here on beat 4. Now we're not getting the full fill, so why don't we actually make this pattern a little longer by duplicating it and have it be 2 bars. And let's have the fill come in on the second bar. So we can start combining the different patterns, the fills, the intros, the endings, all of it. And remember that stop trigger that I told you we would talk about later? Well, we can use this note, this is B4, to draw in a stop into our MIDI clip. So let's find the note B4. If I insert that here, even though we've got notes in, the beat is going to stop right here on beat 4. So it's just another way of using a MIDI note to control what the plugin is doing. But let me show you a way that's going to give you a bit more control. For that, let's jump over to a new title. Let's go ahead and jump over to Circuits, the classic 70s drum machine kind of sound. Same logic here. We have the key range of C3, C4, and beyond. If I hold a key down, we get the pattern. But if you notice, each of these keys has a small dot grid at the top of the note. If I click and drag that into my DAW, I'm going to drag it to an empty clip slot here in Ableton Live. If I double click what we just dragged in, you can see that we get the full piano MIDI roll for that pattern. Now that's a really, really simple pattern, but if we go over here and look at this dope pattern, you can see that they can get pretty complex with different velocities, different sort of off-grid, more human sounding timing. That is sort of the magic of Beatmaker when it comes to getting the authentic sound and working beyond just loops. We have access to the full MIDI. Let's replicate that process again with dope. I go into dope, so I find a pattern that I like. Let's say I like this one here. I grab it and drag it in, drop it, take a look at the MIDI roll, and what do we have here? All the individual notes of that pattern, which means if, say, I don't like that kind of persistent crash, I'd like it just on the downbeat, I now have the freedom to just edit it, take those out, and just keep the first one. Or I could change up the kick pattern completely, take this hip-hop beat and just make it a 4-to-the-floor dance beat or something. It's up to you, but that's the freedom of being able to drag the patterns in like that. You have the ability to edit each individual note, but having access to those patterns is what gives you the nuance of Beatmaker 3. You can see that some of these notes, they're not completely on the grid. The velocities are specifically tailored to the pattern, all which culminates in a very, very authentic sound. And that's the same across all of the Beatmaker titles. Now, it's not like we only get one set of patterns in these titles. If you can see, we have style patterns here, each with their own associated BPM, so they're going to sound best in the range of BPM that they're labeled. But each of these contains a different selection of patterns. So you remember we were changing up our kit earlier, which changes up the individual drum sounds that we're using. We also have the ability to change up the kind of style that we're playing in, which gives us access to these different patterns. So pretty much at every level, you have all the control you need. You can change the kit as a whole. You can change the individual samples within that kit if you want to make some tweaks. You can change the mix and overall sound of your kit, and you can change the style and the patterns that you get out of it. And speaking about all of the nuances we have control over, I want to direct your attention to the micro timing button here. Here we get a quantized slider, which at 0%, the beats will play more loosely, less on the grid. But the more and more we increase the quantized slider, the more rigid and directly on the grid they will be. And we'll see this show up when we drag these patterns in. Remember, if you've already dragged a pattern into your DAW, changing this menu isn't going to do anything. But let's see what it looks like with the quantize all the way up. I'm going to drag this pattern in, and let's just examine it for a moment. Take a look at how everything is very cleanly on the lines. Now, let's go back into Beatmaker. And let's go ahead and bring that all the way down and drag the same pattern in. Take a look now. same exact pattern, but with nuances in the timing. You can see little off-grid hits here and there, making the whole thing sound a little more human, a little more natural. In micro timing, you do have control over that. Let's do a little before and after. Here's the 100% quantized pattern. Very straight and non-quantized. And quantized down to 0%. Just makes you move differently. All right, and with that, I think we've covered all of the basics, all of the foundations, and how to use the Beatmaker plugin. Each one of these titles has a free trial, so definitely dive in and find which title is best for you based on the kind of music that you're going to be making. More info down in the description. My name is Taetro, here with Ujam. That's all for now. Have a good one.